Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Why I Left podcast. In today's episode, I chat with Dr. Michelle Gordon. Dr. G is a surgeon in New York with 15 plus years of experience who closed her multi-million-dollar single specialty practice after feeling burned out and unfulfilled. Now, she's open about giving her life to medicine, but realized that professional freedom came when it was time to move on. So let's go check out her story. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Dr. Michelle Gordon. In addition to being a surgeon who worked on the front lines during COVID, Dr. G now coaches exhausted, high-achieving professionals to love life again through her Launch Your Life coaching program. And she's also the host of the Launch Your Life podcast. So I'm really excited to have her join the program. So how you doing, Dr. G? How's everything?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. And so, prior to discussing how your career really pivoted during the pandemic, would love for our listeners to get a chance to hear about your upbringing and where you call home.
Yeah. So I grew up in Washington State, southeastern Washington State. And if you really want to know about like my upbringing and what it had, I just started a memoir series on my podcast, and you can go to episode 162, and I think there's 7 episodes there. So on the Launch Your Life podcast, I can tell you all about like growing up in, where they made the plutonium for Nagasaki.
Oh, wow.
So I talk about the history of the town and what it was like growing up there. I live in New York now. I came to New York for my residency back in 2001. I watched the Twin Towers burn across the bay just after I started my surgical residency. And I still live here, but I took a job in New York after I finished my residency.
And what have been some of the things that you've been passionate about professionally?
Wow. So it took me a long time to kind of get my stride. I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I finished my residency, and I had to really coach myself, before I even knew it was coaching. I was sitting in the doctor's lounge one day, the OR lounge, and I was like, God, I wonder if they're going to find out. Once they're going to find out, I don't know what I'm doing. And then I did kind of a retrospective of my work, and I'm like, well, if I didn't know what I was doing, wouldn't I get like called and have to take people back all the time? And so I got a lot more confidence when I realized that I wasn't getting called at night. I didn't have a lot of complications. So that felt pretty good.
No, that's great. And now, what I love as I was, looking up your background, just an amazing career, right? And so tell us a little bit about your work journey and what's worked well in the many environments that you've been a part of.
Yeah. So I have never really been employable. And it took me a long time to realize that. I had trouble through my residency. I've got a personality that is really big and direct, and some people really like me, some people really don't like me. And that's just, how I am. And when I finished my residency, I took this job where I got to be my own boss. So I had a loan from I had to pay it back with time and that sort of thing. So, and I made like 7 times the amount of money I was making as a resident. So it was really great. But then I had to like figure out how to run a business. And I was really pissed that I didn't get any business training throughout my medical career. And I do believe that that's by design, because now, especially when people come out of medical school, they just are cogs in the corporate wheel. So I was doing my practice, and I was by myself. So I was a solo practitioner, and I got burned out. I really did. So by 2000, so I started in 2005. By 2009, I was like, I can't do this. And I actually took a break. And I did some locums. I closed my practice for a while. The hospital then asked me to come back. And when I was a medical student, I had a doctor in the NICU say to me, your worst enemies are going to be other doctors. And I kind of poo-pooed it. I really didn't think it was real. But when I took this job, I met with the chairman of the department, and he said to me, you're not going to make a living here. And I just kind of laughed it off. And I said, look, I just need coverage. So just cover me when I go out of town, assist me when I need it. But it was already hostile. from the very, here I am, a brand new surgeon, just coming out, and I didn't have any mentors, and it was already hostile. So that was kind of where I started. And then quickly I became the busiest surgeon, and there was so much jealousy that it was really hard for me to get any coverage. So if I couldn't go on vacation, and I just burned out. So I quit. One day I just called up the VP of medical affairs, and I said, I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm not doing this anymore. And I quit. So I had like a mini breakdown, and I didn't realize at the time that it was my mental health that was suffering.
Wow. And, you have a really interesting story about how you even got into the medical profession and getting into medical school, right? So tell us that story of getting into medical school, how your career began. And, I'd love to hear this.
Okay. I knew when I was 5 years old, I wanted to be a doctor. And I made this decision at 5 when my mom made some sort of a statement that her brothers were rich, they were doctors. And so my 5-year-old brain decided that the only way I was going to make money was to be a doctor, and I was going to make my mom happy. And so that's why I became a doctor. And I tried to do other careers. I tried to do music. I sang coloratura soprano. I really, really loved it, but I couldn't, I had this other program running. And so I went to college when I started college when I was older. So I got married at 23 and went straight to community college, spent 2 years in community college. And then I transferred to a school called Harvey Mudd College, which is one of the best schools in the country, competes with MIT and Caltech for students. I felt really honored to be there. And I had a baby while I was there. I was the only student ever to do that. And my marriage broke up. I was like, I got to do something. My son got cancer. And I was like, okay, I need to do something. And I applied to medical schools. And I applied to all these medical schools, but my GPA was low because I went to this really, really competitive school. As my GPA was only 2.9. And I got one interview, and the school was 7 miles from my house. 7 days before the interview, my brother died. And so I went to his funeral and then went to my interview. And I was waitlisted. But since I was there, I kind of stayed in touch with them. I would call the director of admissions. I would say, look, I'm right here. And this was in the days, it was in the 90s. It was 1996. And it was before we had cell phones, but we didn't really have answering machines other than the tape ones. So I would call from my office at work like 3 or 4, 5 times a day. Like, is there any message? Is there any message? And then as the enrollment date got closer, I called the director of admissions even more. I said, look, I'm right here. I'm here. I'll drop everything. I'll come to school. So one day I made one of those phone calls, and there was a message on the answering machine. And it said, we have a seat for you. We just need this money. And it wasn't a lot. It was like $1,250 or something. But in 1996, I was a single parent. I didn't have the money. So I called my dad. I said, Dad, listen, I got a seat in medical school, but I need $1,250 like right now to keep my seat so I can start in 5 days. And he wired it. It's the only time I've ever used Western Union. He wired it to me through Western Union. And I went and picked it up that day. I left work, went to Western Union at the grocery store or something, and then drove over there and secured my seat. I missed the coat ceremony. I missed all that stuff. I just showed up in class the first day. So that was, if you believe in the law of attraction and manifestation, I would say that was probably one thing that I really manifested in my life was like, I have to go to school. I have to go to school. I have to go to school. And that happened.
Wow. That's amazing. And, I love the perseverance, right? I mean, you knew you wanted it from the beginning, and look, and there it hit, it happened. And so now what I'd love to do is take you back to March of 2020. Now you are one of the first doctors that I've had on the show. And so this kind of segment around COVID really, is hitting close to home because I'm in healthcare right now as well. And so COVID hits us in March of 2020. We're introduced to the pandemic as we know it now. And I noticed, look, you were on the front lines, and you've been very open about that. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about really how the pandemic affected you.
Well, so I want to just go back for a minute and say, I left medicine for a little while. I came back because they asked me to. I was unemployable, and then I went back and reopened my practice. As I reopened my practice, I started growing it, and I grew it to 5 surgeons. And at the end of 2019, I went to Antarctica. And I'm in Antarctica, and I keep hearing all this stuff about Wuhan. And I'm there, and I said to my wife, I'm like, this is big. This is going to be like 5 years, and it's going to affect the whole world. And so this was January 2020, maybe December of 2019. And I was like, this is really big. So I knew it was coming, but I didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was. So in November of 2019, one of my surgeons died by suicide. And that was a big wake up call for me. And he was in a really, really contentious divorce. He told me he loved his work. It had nothing to do with work, but his divorce was really a problem. And that made me really look at what was important in my life. And I had realized that it was time to get out of medicine, but I didn't know how it was going to happen. And I did not like leading surgeons. There was a lot of resentment. I was trying to leverage myself, and instead of them understanding that, and maybe it was my communication, I don't know, I just wasn't able to communicate it well. And so there was a lot of resentment. And so I was like, I know I need to end this, but then COVID hits and everyone's dying, so I'm going to the hospital. I'm wearing 3 masks, operating on sick people who not only have like perforated colons, but they have COVID too. And nobody was surviving COVID. Nobody. I mean, everybody was having organ failure, and they were getting proned, and they didn't have any lines. So I was lining people up in the ICU. I was giving them hemodialysis access. I was giving them central lines just for venous access. And there was one day I did 8 lines, 4 people in like 40 minutes inside the ICU. Because there were that many people who were sick. And COVID took one of my favorite nurses. I mean, it was demoralizing in New York because nobody survived COVID. Nobody. And then because we didn't understand the disease, we'd go to the hospital, we'd keep our shoes and clothes, we'd take them off in the garage, put them in a bag, and run upstairs to take a quick shower right away because we didn't know how it was transmitted. We weren't, so we're walking around in our underwear, and it was really not very much fun.
For our listeners, explain a little bit about what drawing a line is.
Oh, sure. Putting in a central line. So oftentimes, people have IVs, but when the blood gets really thick, so what was happening with COVID is because of the inflammation, the blood was getting really thick. And so, and the veins were collapsing, they weren't able to get IVs in. And so basically a central line it usually goes in the neck or under the clavicle. And it is IV access that generally will last throughout the hospitalization. And then if somebody what was happening with COVID is because the blood was so thick, we were having organ failure. And a lot of these people needed hemodialysis because they were having kidney failure. And so I was putting in those lines as well.
Wow. No, thank you for that. And so now, what were some of the things that you started to learn as the pandemic kind of drew on?
In what way? What about myself or about COVID?
Well, I guess a little bit of both. Really, it's like learnings about yourself and learnings about, about your practice and whether or not this is something that, you still wanted to do. Like how did those things start?
Yeah, there were a couple things. What happened with COVID was that it became really hard to even enter the hospital, and it became like a police state, and it was upsetting to me. I didn't like that. And that was a big part of it. But the other thing was that I had taken a lot of call. I was taking 10 days of call every single month for, since 2012. And I was tired. I kept thinking, I just want to sleep through the night. I just want to sleep through the night. And to me, it was worth it to close down my practice just to sleep through the night because I couldn't. And so I think I was going to close the practice anyway. And it was on the way. I don't think COVID had hit yet, but because I closed the practice at the end of July of 2020, and COVID came in January, February. So I was really ready for a change. I was was tired, and I wasn't being fulfilled by the work, and I was angry. I was really angry.
And now, before we get into the why you closed it, when you think about as COVID was kind of ongoing, what was the impact to your business? Because it sounds like you were working nonstop, but tell us a little bit about the impact that it had on you and some of the folks who worked with you.
Yeah, so we did mostly emergencies, and so in terms of my practice, we didn't have to worry about electives for the most part, but it was really hard to even get OR time for emergencies because they just didn't want to use the OR because they didn't know how it was being transmitted. So, and then we would have these complications where people would have perforated colons or gallbladders or whatever, and they'd have COVID at the same time. And it's like, well, what do you do first? How do you treat this? And so there was that conundrum. But just for me, it was really the change in the way we were treated. Like we weren't partners in healthcare anymore. We were a cog in the wheel, even though I was an independent practice. They wanted me to follow all these protocols just to walk into the hospital and as if we weren't adults, as if we weren't able to take care of ourselves outside of the hospital. And so, and I'm sure as a hospital administrator, you have another view on that. But for me, it was just, it was like a straw with on top of everything else. I mean, it was already burned out. I was already wondering if I even belonged in the world. I was so depressed. I didn't enjoy my work. I loved the patients and I loved the actual operating. I thought that was great. The problem was the way that the culture is in hospitals in America. Because it's a practice, it's not an exact science, and things happen. And if you make a mistake, you can lose your whole career. And yes, there are egregious mistakes, and then there are not so egregious mistakes. And obviously, egregious mistakes you need to re-educate and things like that. But the way that our peer review system, or M&M is what we call it in surgery, morbidity mortality conference, it's so punitive that I had anxiety every time I needed to cut a cystic duct, for example, because I was like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? So much second guessing. It was hard. I mean, and I didn't like living like that.
I can imagine. And so now look, after, about being in practice for about 15 years, right? You decided, look, you hang it up in July of 2020, like you mentioned. And so ultimately, why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Because I realized that it wasn't my calling. So it took me 30 years to realize I was in the wrong career. And because of a program that got set in my subconscious when I was 5 years old, I became a doctor. I don't regret it. I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't have those experiences. But I really excel at helping people find out where they're stuck and helping people reinvent themselves to the point that they love their lives every minute of their lives. And that is I'm fed by it. I love it. It makes my heart sing. It doesn't feel like a drudgery. And I have to thank surgery for giving me enough capital that I haven't had to worry about money as I've figured out what my next calling is.
No, that's great. And so making that decision, like to finally make that call, how did it impact you to say like, hey, like in July, like once it was done, like how did it feel?
Oh, it was such a relief. Imagine sitting underneath a weight of a bridge or an elephant and it just comes up, it comes off. It was a huge relief. And at the time I had a business that was doing okay. I would do launches. I'd make $30,000 to $50,000. It was okay, but I didn't understand. It's a very different business doing an online business from doing medicine, because people in medicine, they just come to you, they're sick, you take care of them. But persuasion and copywriting and likability and all those things that factor into having people trust you enough to open their wallets it's a very different sort of business. And it's been an interesting, few years of understanding that and learning how to go pro in that fashion.
No, that's great. And it sounds like, so there's some learnings here, right? And so what you made that decision, now you're pivoting into this new space. What are now some of your new learnings about yourself that you've kind of picked up throughout this process?
Yeah. I think the biggest learning is that every single limitation in my life is because of some belief I have. And it's hard to uncover those beliefs on your own. And for me, especially, I rely on coaches to help me see where I'm stuck, because I just can't examine my own mind with my own mind. It's very hard. And there's so many things that we think are the way things have to be because it's the truth. But in reality, it's just a truth. And it's just one way of thinking. There's almost always another way to look at something. And the example I like to give is, if I pick up here's my little headphone holder. If I pick it up and drop it, it's going to fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. That is a law. It's not going to change. I mean, it might change a little bit as you get closer to the equator, right? But we have the law of gravity. That's never going to change. Things are going to fall down to the earth. But when it comes to things like marriage, for example, we stay married because we believe that that's what we're supposed to do, or we believe that we're committed to somebody. But do you have to? No, right? It's a belief. And people who get divorced believe that they're going to be better when they leave the marriage. So that's just one example of how belief affects our lives. And for me, it's like, does it have to, I guess the question I always ask myself now, the big learning is, does it have to be this way? How can I grow? And can I talk to myself more kindly in a way to grow? Because a business can only grow as much as especially an entrepreneurial business can only grow as much as the owner.
Oh, absolutely. And now there's a lot that's been happening since you've left, right? And so we talked a little bit about it in the beginning. So you initially started a podcast called the Menopause Movement, but you recently pivoted to Launch Your Life. So tell us about, the origins of Menopause movement and really why you moved on from it. And then we'll talk, and then you can tell us a little bit about Launch Your Life.
Sure. So Menopause Movement, I started because menopause for me was very disruptive, and menopause for a lot of women is really disruptive. And so what I've discovered is that menopause is almost like a second puberty where you don't get to talk. Okay. And it's true, because it's with the loss of hormones, we get brain fog. We have a lot of emotions. We don't know what's happening. We don't know if we're having dementia. We have sleep disruption. There's a lot going on in menopause, but my focus was always reinvention. It was menopause was an option to come in and reinvent yourself. And I was attracting people who weren't like me. I was attracting housewives and people on disability and people who wanted a quick fix or wanted to take a pill. And there isn't a pill, powder, or potion for menopause. It's not a medical condition. You just go through it. And I started thinking about, where are my strengths and what really works? What do I like doing? And I like helping people see how they can create the life of their dreams. And that's where I really am good. And I help now in Launch Your Life. What I do is I help people figure out what it is they want and then systematically go after it.
Very nice. And what was there actually, what was the pivotal moment, or was there a pivotal moment in deciding to start Launch Your Life?
Yeah. So the biggest pivotal moment for me was I actually took a course on differentiation. And as I did the work for that, which it was an 8-week intensive with a guy by the name of Louis Grenier. And as I did the work for that, I had to do customer interviews. I had to kind of figure out, it was true market research that I'd never learned, because oftentimes if you want to build a business, an online business, there's a lot of gurus out there who will give you a fraction of what you got to do. And they don't teach you marketing. They teach you, this is my thing. This is how you do this one little piece, but there's not anybody who really does a comprehensive, this is how you do it start to finish. And so I had to piece a lot of things together. But when I took this course from Louis, it was very comprehensive. And it was basically, look, who are you talking to? Go out and talk to them, and then figure out how that fits into what you like and where your strengths are. And so as I did the analysis of all of these interviews, I was like, oh, it's not about menopause. And in fact, as I was doing these menopause interviews and teaching, I was like, I don't care about menopause. It's not about menopause. It's about the opportunity menopause gives us for reinvention. And so, I did the podcast was like, here's how you deal with menopause weight. Here's how you deal with adrenal fatigue. Here's how you deal with, supplements, blah, blah, blah. Right. But then there were other things in there, like, how do you think? What's the best way to fix your mindset in menopause? And so I focused on that. And as I realized it was really mindset was the main thing, I was like, let's pivot and just call it Launch Your Life. So all the menopause stuff is there on Launch Your Life. But the real mindset piece started, I think, at about episode 1. I think it's like 150, 153, something like that. And then I pivoted even further and said, in 2018, I wrote a memoir I'm going to serialize it. And so now I'm doing that. I've got 7 serialized episodes from my life and where I grew up, and talking about how I became who I am, and the resilience that I have developed through coming through the setbacks that I came through.
No, that's awesome to hear. And, look, a part of this show is, we like to, or I like to get across, is really advice for our listeners. We have some really great feedback from folks who have listened to the show, and how they really picked up some really key nuggets from our guests. And so would love for you to share some of your thoughts on the following. So when you think about those folks who may be listening and who may have a similar experience to yours, whether they're in healthcare or not, right? But I love the physician angle, right? Because, I ended, what was funny when I was, sourcing guests, right? I ended season 1 with my first attorney, which is great. And now we're in season 2 and I have my first physician on. And so I'm loving this, right? So you could speak to your tribe or more, right? But what advice would you give to them if they're in a similar position, but really don't know what to do next?
Yeah. So burnout is real, and it's real with doctors, especially as COVID demoralized us. And the problem, I think, for doctors, especially, so if you're a doctor and listening to this, is that we can't really come together because of the way the laws have created. We can't, it's really hard for us to affect change. And the only thing we can do is work on ourselves. And so if you're experiencing burnout, the first thing you have to do is put yourself first and stop putting everyone else first. And that can be hard because, especially women, we're taught that, our very first obligation is to the men in our lives. We're taught that from a very, very young age. We're also taught that we have to look a certain way and act a certain way and serve a certain way. And that's just part of living in a patriarchy. And that's nothing against men. It just is how our society is. And so I really like to encourage women, especially, to take a step back and look at everything you're doing and start to say no more.
Okay. And now when you think about those who are looking to create a better future for themselves, what key piece of advice would you give someone looking to make a step in that direction?
Well, the first step to creating a better future for yourself is knowing exactly how you want it to look. So take a step back, sit down, and decide what you want your days to look like. I mean, down to the granular. What's it like to go shopping? What's it like to cook dinner? Where do you take your walks? What does your house look like? Who are you with? When you can really sit down and get granular about your dream life, then you can start to work backwards and take steps to what it is you want.
And now, as you venture into this next really, chapter in your professional career, what's the impact that you're looking to have in that next chapter?
Yeah, I haven't figured out a number impact in terms of who I want to reach, but what I really want to do is, and what I know I can do, is I can help you reach your ideal life in a systematic fashion. So it's science, right? It's like, this is what I want. And then we just work backwards. Like, okay, this is what I'm gonna work on this quarter. This is going to work on this month. This is what I'm gonna work on this week. And I have daily accountability. And it's not really accountability, because we talk about mindset. I mean, anything you want in life wants you back. That's just how it is. But to get it, you've got to get some accountability. You got to start taking action. You can't just think, because a goal without a plan is just a wish.
Definitely. And there's that level of intentionality that is important too. So I'd love to hear that. Any success stories that maybe you could share with some of the folks that you've worked with so far?
Oh, yeah. So I had a bunch of, I had like 6 people in my, I had a cohort, and I have another type of cohort going now. But in the first real Launch Your Life cohort, I had 6 people. And one of them was a private chef who had moved from New York to Florida and was trying to build her practice, and had a lot of trepidation about going out and meeting people and doing the networking she needed to do. And the course is only 8 weeks long. And by the end of the 8 weeks, her practice was fully booked, because she gained the confidence that she needed. So that's one. I had a guy who owns a video production studio who was just stuck because the pandemic took away, he was doing live events. The pandemic took away 90% of his income. And he just would go and sit at his office and just look out the window, and wasn't able to take any action. So he was able to change his mindset and start to take some action and kind of fix all of his problems. And of course, they weren't all fixed in 8 weeks, but he was able to take action to the point that he felt better about it. I had a young girl who, and I say young girl, she's like 25, who decided to leave an abusive relationship just before we started the program. And it just cemented all of the things that she needed to do. And she took a really great job, best job she's ever had in her life. I had somebody that I knew from another program who came in and did this program, a woman who realized that the only reason she thought she needed to lose weight was because of everybody else's perception. And she said, I don't really want to lose weight. And that's okay. And that's a big step for women. It's a huge, huge step for women because of all of the external stimuli we get about body image and shame. And so for her, I mean, that was huge. And then I have other women I've been working with who were with me throughout menopause movement and then came with me into Launch Your Life, who one of them said, I would have paid 5 times as much to see this much change in my life. She'd been living in the same place for 30 some odd years and had always dreamed of moving to a rocky shoreline. And through understanding herself better and realizing that what she really wanted, she was able to get out of this house. I mean, can you imagine I've been in my house for like 12 years and there's so much stuff here. I think the thought of moving is frightening. She was able to get out of this house of 34 years. She moved into an apartment, got her house sold, and she's moving to a rocky shoreline. And that's just one aspect of her life, but that's probably the biggest one because it's something she'd always wanted to do, but had never been able to take action. So through the systematic approach that we have in the program.
No, that's awesome to hear.
Yeah.
Making an impact, Dr. G. I love to hear that. Thanks. And now, let's talk a little bit about, folks' relationship with failure, right? I know that's one aspect, I've seen in your work. And really, how can we people better manage failure?
Yeah. So I like to preface failure with suffering, and suffering comes from our thoughts about something, and it usually comes from unmet expectations. So we start there. Now, in medicine, as a surgeon, failure always meant morbidity, mortality, something was wrong. And it's very hard to change your relationship with failure when you're in medicine. So what I had to do was look at it from a different perspective and say, I'm trying to learn how to do something new here in this business. And the only way to do it is to try and iterate. And a lot of times you fail more than you win. It's just how it is, or succeed. And so I like to look at it as when I try something, I either win or I learn. And that has helped me a lot. If anybody on here is a stock trader, you have more losing trades than you have winning trades. But when you win big.
Right. No, I like that. And now I also understand you're doing a market research survey. So tell us a little bit about it and, where our listeners can participate.
Yeah. So I have a market research survey so that I'm trying to understand burnout a little bit better and overwhelm. And you can go to discover.drgordon.me and take that survey. And then I'm going to pick some people to actually have a one-on-one with when you complete that survey. But it's really just for me to understand how burnout is affecting people, professionals specifically.
No, that's good. And that has been such a hot topic of late. I mean, obviously, especially in healthcare, but really overall. I mean, one of the big themes that I'm hearing in my show around the Great Resignation is people just really kind of hitting that wall and then being able to see, a different light, if you will, down a different tunnel has really been eye-opening. So I'll make sure I put that information in the show notes too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We work a lot in America. We are expected to work 50 out of 52 weeks, whereas the rest of the world works 43, 44 weeks a year. And there is not a good balance here because America truly is the home of the corporation and the land of the profit. It's not, and I don't think it's anything else. That's really what it is. And so when you are a cog in a wheel, you have to live by their rules. And so I really think that anyone who can build a side hustle is going to have a lot more freedom going down the road as the economy changes, as crypto comes in as all those things happen.
No, definitely. And now you mentioned this a couple of times. One thing that you're doing with your show is you're revisiting your memoir, right?
Yeah.
And so what is that, as we kind of start wrapping up a little, what has that process been like? It sounded like you started this in 2018.
Yeah.
And now you're really starting to re-release again. So tell us a little bit about what this process has been for you personally.
Well, so learning how to write every day was hard. And in 2018, I met with someone and I said, okay, they said, you got to write down your story because you have a really compelling story. And so I just started writing stories and I finished it sometime in 2018. I just wrote every day. I wrote 1,500 to 2,000 words a day, got to 60,000 words. And I figured it was pretty much done. And then I didn't know how to edit it. I didn't know what to do next. And I tried to, get some of my team to help me with it, blah, blah, blah. So I wasn't able to get anyone else to do this. I have to do this myself, right? I couldn't outsource this one. And I decided that the only way I was going to do it was if I actually started publishing it somewhere. And since I already had the podcast and I just entered my 4th year of podcasting, I was like, you know what, this is a really good way to get started. And so I've done 7 episodes, which starts with my young life and kind of went to, I'm ready to go into the teenage years, but I've taken a break because what I've found is that every episode requires a lot of research. And even though they're like only 10 to 20 minutes long, they take me about 6-7 hours each to really put together and make the story work and try and keep it consistent and then kind of fill the gaps in and things like that. So it's been really interesting because I learned a lot about my hometown, which is not only the site of the Manhattan Project in Washington State, but was also a sundown town. And so like my last episode 7 of the memoir series was all about growing up in a racist culture and how to overcome that and how I had to really work hard to overcome that because that's the way things were, right? So it's been really interesting just learning about my hometown and learning about trauma and trauma responses and toxic shame. And so I talk about a lot of that on the podcast.
No, very nice. And I'm looking forward to checking that out. I do have it queued up. So I
Awesome.
definitely have it in the list.
I'd be excited to hear your feedback.
No, definitely. I'll definitely reach out. Yeah. Well, look, Dr. G, I just want to say thank you for taking some time to come on our show and chat. It's been a pleasure hearing your story. Look, I found out about you. You had a really nice post on LinkedIn, and with what I've been doing here, if I see a post and it pops up in my feed, I think one of my contacts either liked your post or something, I'm going to reach out. And so You were so warm when I reached out to you. And so I really appreciate, you coming on, and I love following your content. And so would love for us to stay in touch. I'd love to stay connected. And also, where can our listeners find you online?
Yeah. So on LinkedIn, I'm Dr. Michelle Gordon, Dr. and then MichelleGordon. On Facebook, I'm DRM Gordon. And on Instagram, I'm Dr. Michelle Gordon, Dr. spelled out. And those are the places you can get me. If you want to call me, if you want to reach out to me, you can email me drgordon@drgordon.me.
Very nice. And I'll make sure I put that info in our show notes. Well,
Awesome.
Thank you all. And thank you for coming on today. Again, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Michelle Gordon, for gracing us with her presence, right? The story is amazing. So I really do encourage everybody to go check it out. Like I said, I'll share her information in our show notes. And look, I hope you all have a great week, and we'll make sure we see you next time. All right. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.